Hi, everyone. Welcome to CultureLynx, our very first culture chat. I decided in honor of World Day of Cultural Diversity, which is today, Thursday, May 21st, we would start an interview series where we talk about all things culture. My first guest is my dad. Hi, Daddy.
Hey, Gwen.
It is also, for those of you who don't know, it's actually also Father's Day in Germany, so I thought it'd be a great opportunity to invite my dad as my very first guest. My dad, Bernhard Bluemich, is a world-renowned professor and scientist and researcher in the area of nuclear magnetic resonance. If you look him up, you'll be very impressed, but he's not here to talk about science today. I've invited you, Dad, to talk about German history and German identity. And the reason being is, at CultureLynx, we talk about getting down to your truth and really spreading truth. And I was inspired by actually Chimamanda Adichie's Danger of a Single Story. There's a TED Talk out there. I think she recorded it in 2009. I shared it with you, Dad. And she talks about the danger of a single story, and it's really about stories as a powerful weapon that can really shape the narrative of a culture and a people's history, and the dangers that arise from only sharing one perspective or one side of the story. So as you know, Dad, being bicultural and being German actually has been, it's been interesting, from an identity perspective and from a perspective of national pride, we haven't, for the longest time, being German was actually, not a good thing based on World War II and, world history and the history of Germany. So I wanted to invite you to share a little bit about what it means to be German. And my dad, for all of you, my dad is a post-World War II child. What was that like, Dad, growing up in Berlin, born and raised?
Well, I mean, I was born in 1952, so that's about 7 years after the war. So when you look back at your own history and say, well, 7 years, I can't remember that. It's not long back. Of course, I can't remember when I was born, but I remember growing up there, maybe 3-4 years old, and we lived in my grandfather's apartment. And the reason that we lived in his apartment was because most of Berlin was destroyed, was bombed away, and most houses were badly damaged. And we were lucky enough that my grandfather, who had a pretty big apartment in the center of Berlin, had plenty of room. And my father rented, since he was returned from World War II, towards actually before the end of the war, as a soldier, he rented parts of that apartment. And that's where then also my mother moved when they married in 1950. And that's where we were born and where I spent the first six years of my life. But I remember holding my mother's hand and going shopping, and of course, no plastic bags, by the way. It was a shopping net. Everybody, and you always went with your net where you put the stuff in, and you had probably 2 or 3 nets, so you can buy lots of stuff.
Like a fishing net.
It was a shopping net. It looks like a fishing net, but it opened up like a plastic bag, essentially. And you would reuse it. There was nothing you would throw away. So she went shopping and into something like a co-op or coop, like the Bostonians say. And so we went along the street, and walking along the street, we would just go past bombed out houses. All these ruins were there. And
so you remember that, being a little boy?
You bet. And even when we moved to Tegel is the part of Berlin where the airport is. That's now being closed in a couple of months. There were still ruins all over the place. There were houses, and we always said, oh, this is now being fixed up, and this is disappearing, and this is disappearing. So now you have a very hard time to find traces of World War II and gun holes in the facade of a building or so. Every now and then there is still something to see. But that was sort of my experience, the reconstruction of Berlin. And then there was the political situation of being in West Berlin, and West Berlin was in eventually, as of 1961, August 13, was walled in by the East Germans. And we were told, and now this is your point, of getting a one-sided story, we were told that was the Russians. And because there was a Cold War period, you know, United States against Russia, the main antagonist. And so we were walled in, and we got, essentially there was only radio, there was no television. We didn't have television. I mean, there was television actually since 1932, when the first TV transmission was from the Berliner TV tower in those days. But we didn't have one, we couldn't afford one. We had a radio, we had a newspaper, and this is how we got the information. And the political information said it's the Russians, and all Russians basically are bad people. And this is something that followed me and occupied my mind, and some basic truth that I learned in these childhood days, and that was ingrained into my mind.
You made me think of Omi's diary. So Omi's my grandmother, your mom. She passed away a few years ago, 2017, but she lived through World War II. I mean, talk about a child of the war. So after she passed, we discovered her diary, right? We were cleaning up her apartment.
Yeah, the diary was from exactly the full year of 1945, January 1st to December 31st. And she more or less had an entry every day. So this is, you know, the final desperate fight against, you know, Germany being occupied and losing the war. The big point was lose the war. And, you know, all that glory of the 30s went down the drain. That was the feeling in those days, this, you know, feeling of superiority, which they got educated, of being superior. You know, they can do anything. They have the best military in the world. They can tell everybody, and they're going to be victorious in every fight. That was the mood that everybody was in, which was reflected.
Right. That was Hitler's narrative, and he was very influential, and he was very good at.
Yes, that was in those days the narrative of Hitler, and you may reflect whose narrative it is today, but let's stay with those days. And the big realization was then, as the Russians came in, that because they fought the Battle of Berlin. You know, the Americans came later when the Battle of Berlin was done, and then the Berlin was divided up, and in exchange for a section of Berlin, they got a larger section, they gave a larger section of Germany to the Russians. So this is all the past history. And the culture in those days was, you know, the victor, whoever is victorious, he takes it all. You take what you need, you take what you want, and that includes material goods and, of course, the women.
So Omi was talking, she wrote a lot about, you know, it's interesting in reading her diary, which you transcribed very nicely. It was interesting to read that, you know, she really seemed very biased against the Russians, but that was her experience, right? Because she lived in a section of Berlin that was occupied by the Russians.
No, it was also the propaganda of the Nazis. Okay, the Nazis told and inscribed in everybody's brain, you know, this is a one-sided story that you get. Russians are bad. You know, these are communists, just socialists. Think of the word socialist in the US today. You know, it's something extremely bad. You go to Germany, something socialist isn't bad at all.
Yeah.
You know,
but I mean, right, war is obviously very nasty, and, you know, nobody wins in war. But I mean, she did talk about her friends, you know, women in the neighborhood being routinely raped by soldiers. I mean, it was horrible back then, right? But then combine, you know, you combine that with propaganda, the way that they, you know, perceived the Russians back then.
Yeah, but you know, in those days they only had radio basically and newspapers, and that was all. You couldn't listen to. Yes, well, my grandfather, my mother's father, he was a radio fanatic, so he built his own radios. He could listen to other radio stations, but of course then there was a language barrier to listen to those, and you would largely get your information from the local media.
Let me ask you a question. So, you know, in the United States, obviously, when we talk about World War II, a lot of it is really around persecution of the Jews, right? I mean, it was absolutely horrible.
Oh, yeah.
Hitler did back then. What was the sentiment? What was Germans' understanding of what was happening to the Jews during that time? Because, you know, my only insight really from a German's perspective is basically what I've learned growing up in Germany, right? My own education about, you know, in public school about World War II and the horrors that were committed against the Jewish people. But from Omi's diary, she doesn't talk about it very much. Do you have any insight as to what German citizens, what did they know about what was happening at the time?
Well, I have to admit that reading Omi's diary, this was the main question that I wanted to find out. Because, you know, when I came to the US in 1974 as a student, you know, I was suddenly confronted with all this bias against Germans, which, you know, I was puzzled. I was surprised why. And of course, it is a story of the atrocities that the Germans committed. But
Hold that thought. My dog is eating something. I need to get it away from him. Okay, continue. All right.
Oh, back on?
Yes.
Okay. So, and this is also what we learned in school, like growing up, you know, going to school every year, we repeated the story of the Third Reich, the atrocities that were committed. We learned
As did I, how many years later, going to
of course, and it probably still goes on, because the message is, this cannot ever happen again. And
what did they teach you in school? Because I remember, I mean, this is my education of World War II, and this is actually where I think a lot of the shame of being German was passed down from generation to generation.
Oh yeah, I mean, this
my generation,
you know, this put that shame into you, that, you know, you were guilty and you didn't quite know why.
Right.
You know, of course, you knew there was what happened before you were born.
Right.
And you kind of inherit that guilt, and because you are a descendant of the people that have committed that and of the system, you are guilty as well.
Right.
That was sort of what was carried over. By the way, the only people that, and as a scientist, I meet people from all over the world. And my best American friends, many of them are Jewish. And they were the ones that would understand before anybody else that the situation is different between those who commit a crime and the children and descendants of the people.
It's interesting you say that, and I know we're jumping around quite a bit, but my experience, I had to think back to Chimamanda's TED Talk, right? Because actually it resonated with me so much. She talks about, you know, being Nigerian, and she goes to the United States to go to college. So that's her first experience in the US. And people just automatically assume that she's uneducated and poor, and she grew up, you know, with basically nothing to her name. And that wasn't the case. She came from a very educated family. In my case, I remember freshman year of college, it was parents' weekend. And, you know, I was in a suite with all Jewish girls. And it was really interesting because, I mean, it didn't matter to me. I didn't even think about it twice until a woman came into my suite, and she says to me, "Oh, so you're the German girl." And the very first question she asked me, she said, "Are your parents Nazis?" And I just, my jaw dropped, because I couldn't believe that anybody would accuse my family of being Nazis or even ask a question like that. But it occurred to me that they didn't really know Germany or German history, other than, you know, the stories that were passed down to them by their parents and their parents' parents, who, you know, were Holocaust survivors. So of course they have no idea what Germany was like or what it meant to be German. It was really interesting.
I think bias always evolves from a lack of knowledge.
Right.
And the lack of knowledge comes either because you don't have access, it's limited, the information is limited that you can get at all, even if you want to, you can't get it, or because you choose not to get it. Today we are more in a situation that we choose not to get certain information because we feel uncomfortable, we want to hear something different, we want to see something different, so we do it.
You raise a very interesting point, right? It's getting down to truth and sharing what the real truth is, all perspectives, all sides of the story. It can be very uncomfortable. People want to protect.
Yeah, but in the end, it's always personal because everybody has a limited set of experiences, and so the so-called truth that one shares is based on a limited set of experience. So it's a relative truth. And of course, truth cannot be relative. As a scientist, it's absurd to think that a truth is relative. 2
Right.
plus 2 is 4, you know, and it can't be 4.1 or 0.9, 3.9. It's definitely 4, you know, the truth is 4. So there's no variation in that.
Well,
But
then,
the
but
truth
then the
that we
actual,
perceive,
well, there's subjective truth. There's the truth that we perceive based on our emotions and our experiences
yeah,
and
yeah,
our upbringing and such. And the overall truth is really a collection, is a diversity
yeah,
of multiple truths.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Right.
yeah, yeah.
So what
Yeah,
did you learn in school about World War II? Because I'm reflecting on just my education, and I mean, they showed us Schindler's List. If any of you guys have seen Schindler's List, I mean, I was 10. I was 10 when they made me go to the movies and watch Schindler's List, and I was horrified. I mean, I had nightmares for about 3 months straight. And I mean, they showed oh gosh, they showed the medical procedures and the tests that they did on Jewish twins. And it was horrible. Is that what they showed you in school too?
Yeah, we learned that also. You know, this is why I had an aversion against soccer. It's very
Against
strange, you know,
soccer.
because yes, I don't like soccer, and for the very simple reason, the first soccer game that we ever, was it before? No, first we watched the Battle of Stalingrad. You know, and you know that huge battle where the German army basically decimated the population of Stalingrad.
Hmm.
And the atrocities committed there, and it was something that really was in my mind. And part of that movie was when in the Olympic Stadium of Berlin, I think it was Goebbels or Hitler or somebody said, asked the people, "Do you want to have the total war?" And everybody was saluting with the Nazi salute and said and was cheering, "Yes, we want to have the total war." You know, this is, I mean, nobody knew what they were saying, you know, that, you know, once it hit,
Crazy.
they were probably bitterly regretted or didn't remember. And so that was in the Olympic Stadium. So my first soccer game, a couple of weeks later, was in the very same Olympic Stadium where that scene had happened.
Wow.
And I saw these crowds cheering the teams. And there was the same type of emotion that you have a large crowd and everybody cheers either the one team or the other team. So it's again a mass movement where the brain is turned off and you do what the others do.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something where I don't like soccer. I don't like these mass gatherings where people, you know, are all moved by something, you know, the brain turned off, any thinking is
Spoken,
rejected, and you just
spoken like a
follow the
true
flow of
scientist.
emotions.
Yeah. Spoken
Well,
like a true scientist. It's funny because I'm thinking about it. It's a little ironic because I feel like soccer, especially the World Cup, is actually what changed, what made it change in this the sense of German pride and this idea of German identity. Because I remember distinctly, I mean, I moved to the States, as you know, in 2000 and what was it, 2001, after I graduated from high school. And I carried this shame of being German with me for so long. And a lot of it had to do with, sure, being bullied, being bicultural, not fitting in and so on. And I carried that with me. And I always felt like, I kind of didn't want to accept that part of me because it was so different,
yeah,
frowned upon and so on. But coming back to Germany, and when was the last World Cup after that? 2004, maybe?
I forgot. Yeah, this
Something like
is,
that. But you could feel this change of energy in the air. It was like Germany won the World Cup and they celebrated. And I mean, immigrants and foreigners and everyone and Germans, and they all celebrated. And there was really this resurgence of
well,
national
the
pride.
biggest change was, you know, before that, when somebody had the German flag on a flagpole or on the house or so, they would immediately be labeled as a ultra right wing German or maybe even a hidden Nazi.
Ah, it's so
You know,
sad.
you
Yeah.
wouldn't show your flag and say I'm proud of Germany. It's something you just don't
Mhm.
do. This is how we grew up. It's the emotions, and I still have, you know, feel sort of uncomfortable when people say that stuff. Sorry, my phone is ringing,
Nice,
and I have
nice
to
ringtone, Dad.
Peter Borg. Okay, I have to cut that off.
Yeah,
Okay,
well, it's interesting
so
because in the United States, I mean, we say the national anthem, and then I mean, there's a whole process in school, and
yeah,
we
I
never.
had an experience when in 1974 on my very first trip through the U.S. I was hitchhiking down to Florida, and I met a man at the beach, an old man, and he told me he is proud of his flag. And I said,
This is in the United States.
"Wow." In the United States, yes. And he said how successful he was and how thankful he is to the country, and this is why he's proud of the flag. And this that to me was a message where I said, I do not understand this person at all. I have no clue what he is saying. And I still have difficulties consolidating that. I mean, it's achievements, it's energy, it's done, but it's not, the colors of a flag. At least, that's how I see it. It's probably very subjective, and I admit there are many different opinions on that.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that changed with a soccer game in Germany, because suddenly after that, after winning the World Cup, you saw the German flag everywhere. Nobody thought anything bad about it.
Because it's associated with soccer and solidarity, and something.
And everybody thought that's a happy thing to have. That's probably what Americans think when they look at their flag. They're proud of it. We like our flag. Why not say it? Why not be happy about it?
Yeah.
But in those days, I had no clue what this man was saying, because I was in this sort of scenario where I was indoctrinated in the way by the political situation of how I grew up and what I experienced, and how I was confronted with people that are not German and say, oh, you're German. Oh my God.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, they had no clue about the situation of Berlin,
Mm-hmm. It's interesting thinking about the way that World War II and Germans are portrayed. It's typically from the victim.
Hogan's Heroes. You have to watch that show.
From the victim standpoint, right? The German people, I feel like, there's a lot of movies, right? When we think about how people's perception in the United States is influenced.
Oh yeah, the evil guy is always German, or was
evil guy is always German, right? How many Nazi movies are there? The evil guy is always German, but people forget about the plight of the German people, right? There's another story to be told.
Yeah, but we also didn't learn that in school. I didn't learn any of the famous German poets like Goethe or Schiller or so. I didn't learn about Humboldt. Look at how many Humboldt rivers and how the name Humboldt appears on the American map, and on South America even more so. Mm-hmm. And Humboldt, the family grew up three kilometers from where I grew up in Tegel. Mm-hmm. That was a Humboldt residence. I didn't learn I went to the Humboldt school. This is where I got my high school education. I had no clue where Humboldt was. And Humboldt, when he was alive,
who is Humboldt? For all of our viewers out there, who is he?
Yeah, who is he? Think about it. You probably don't know. No clue.
Nobody knows.
I haven't a clue either. And Humboldt, at the time of his life, he was late 1700s until middle 1800s. He was the most well-known person next to Napoleon in Europe in those days, because he spent several years in South America and recorded everything you could ever record. And he could give lectures that would draw crowds from all levels of society. And so he's actually the founder of the sort of the forefather of Green people. He was the Green Party. He was against slavery in those days.
So why do you think you didn't learn about him, even though his name was?
Because we learned about the Communist Manifesto. It was politically cool to read left-wing Russian literature, Mayakovsky. I mean, interesting poetry, absolutely, no doubt about it.
So the German education system suppressed anything that was considered maybe too right.
No, there was the necessity of re-educating Germany so that what happened in the 30s cannot happen again. So somehow, it's like they cope today with the virus, right? You try what works best, and there was no clear plan because it was an unprecedented situation. So how do you re-educate Germans so that their mind is moved out of this, absolute obedience, military accuracy, and I'm told, and so on? This stuff, this is what's called Prussian.
You made me think of the German, the Hitler Youth, right? Because only my grandmother, your mom, was. Yeah,
but how do you train an army today? I mean, turn off their brains, have a march together, and sing songs.
My point is more about the Hitler Youth, which was really one of the many ways that Hitler was able to influence the German movement.
Yeah, but some people followed it, but there are others, like your grandfather, my father. And I'm checking his diaries today, and he had very critical comments in there. I mean, sudden,
I
not
think they
not
weren't
not
just
very
coming
open.
back.
And he was different. My mother was sort of, that's life. I've got to do this. I've got to get food. I'm going to sew a new skirt because I want to feel pretty, and I'm going to help the Red Cross, and maybe I should join the SS to help win the war and to turn the fate of the war at the last minute. When the Russian soldiers were 30 miles away from Berlin. That's the crazy thinking. I mean, that's also the thing is that I discovered people were unaware of the real situation. They just didn't know, and they were preoccupied with daily chores.
Surviving. With surviving. They were preoccupied with surviving.
Exactly. I mean, more and more bombs, more and more things getting destroyed, public transportation not working anymore, not being able to go to school, being on alert, watching out for bomb alerts, having to rush 3 times to the basement for bomb shelters of the bombs flying down. So you had all these things coming. You had no time to think about, or people
Like
just
what happened to all their Jewish friends who all of a sudden disappeared?
No, that was not a worry. That was not a worry. I mean, how much do you think about other people, around you when something happens to them, something bad happens to them? How much action do you
think
really
about it
take?
a little bit, but you might not, right? You might be immediately focused back on your own situation.
So one thing that I kind of relate this type of ignoring facts, which people have done then, how people like my mother could sort of went through this time, in very often very light spirit, good humor and interesting, entertaining. Written in a diary is really entertaining to read. Is sort of how we deal. It's how we deal with environmental change, with climate change.
With climate
I remember that in the late 1990s, there were forecasts that in 2020 we're going to have serious effects on the climate. Temperature is going to be rising, weather is going to be changing, all this stuff. And
nobody's paying attention.
We hear these warnings over and over and over again. And what do? We say, well, it's still okay. Next year, well, it's probably still okay. And we do small adjustments. Well, we don't take charge of the situation. We all say, well, I'm just one person. There are 8 billion people. What can I do? So the excuses, I make up an excuse why I don't do anything. And that includes myself. So I'm not saying I'm doing anything.
We're not willing to face the truth and take responsibility.
Exactly. We are not taking responsibility. Very few people take responsibility. And again, it's an unprecedented situation. So we don't really know exactly what are the proper steps to take. We know there's an uncertainty. Some scientists say this, other scientists say that. I want to have it even differently. I want to be able to travel as I did before and fly long distance. And I want to, burn gasoline in any amount I want, and air pollution.
Luxury, I don't care, right?
Exactly. If I need something, I buy something new, and there's a big garbage dump, and it just gets bigger, and who cares? And yeah.
As long as you can say that you recycle, right?
Exactly. And that sort of silences your conscience.
Right.
Well, I'm recycling.
I'm doing my part.
Yeah,
but
I'm doing my part. I even walk to the store.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if many people do that here.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, but I mean, you come up with reasons, with small things that silence your conscience, but not appropriate action. And we are not even making an effort to see how severe is the situation. You say, oh, this guy said this, and this guy says that. I believe him. Yeah, I trust this person. I trust this person. But I don't want to be bothered. I got other things to do.
Well, we've also lost our ability to think critically and to really question. And that a lot of it has to do, right, when we go back to, again, the danger of a single story or the danger of stereotyping is, there's stories that are made up about people, right, about a people. And a lot of it has to do, by the way, with the power dynamic, right? Germany was in a place where it had lost World War II. It was not superior. It was you know, it was the loser in the world war. And so all these stories that were created, you know, by Hollywood, by all those movies, the Nazi movies that we see, they're very one-sided in the sense that they're created by the winning side, right? And Chimamanda actually, she says it very well, and it has to do with the power structure, right? Who tells a story, how often those stories are told, and in what context those stories are told. And that is the story that we end up believing unless we think critically. And to your point about climate change, right, and the environmental impact of our own doing, is people don't really think critically anymore. They don't question. And they don't question, you know, whether it's the government, whether it's, you know, things that they hear in certain news channels. We don't question and think critically anymore.
Yeah, yeah, that's the problem. I mean, there are the movie industry is one. I mean, this is, you know, an amazing strength in the US. You know, Hollywood is the best sales agency for American culture that you can ever have. You know, this is why people adore the US. Everybody wants to come to the US because you see these Hollywood movies and everybody's cool. And you know, even crime is, you know, you have the heroes and the heroes win, and even crime becomes glorious in that scenario. There are, you know, also movies from the German side reporting sort of other things, like what happened in East Germany during the Cold War. You know, the movies on German television, you know, about resistance, stuff like that. But it's not of interest to an international public. So some Germans watch it, but only some, and it's doesn't bring enough money to translate. And so it won't gain larger popularity, and so it cannot have a changing impact, I think.
Well, Daddy, we only have about 2 more minutes until Zoom kicks me out because I don't have a paper.
Well, here we go.
I know we've only scratched the surface of this conversation. We could talk forever. What do you think? I guess 2 more questions. I mean, in terms of German identity, do you think it's changed? How do you feel being a German? Are you, over the course of your long life that you've lived so far?
Well, there's one experience, you know, I stayed with some really nice people when I was a student in 1975, 1976. And he was actually an airplane pilot who knew Berlin from the top well, so I explained to him where I lived. And one thing my landlady said, she was actually British origin, she said, "Oh, you would fit right in." And even then I thought, why would I fit in? Where would I fit in? Why is that good that I fit in? And she, of course, meant fitting into the American society. And I decided, why would I want to? You know, I had, in fact, I had research equipment far better than I had at the university in the US.
Yeah.
There's something, you know, there was always this feeling, what we have here is the best of the world, and it can't be anything better. And I have to say, people just don't know about Germany. If they knew more about Germany, they wouldn't say these, you know, very simplistic remarks. I feel okay being a German.
So maybe we need to travel more, which will be difficult in the, you know.
Will be difficult with COVID, yes, but travel is the best education you can do. Meet other people. Take the opportunity to meet your neighbors that come from a different country. Discuss with them how life is.
Yeah, be curious, right? Ask questions.
Personal relationships go beyond filtered newspaper and television stories.
Amen. Thank you, Daddy, for your time today.
You're welcome. Okay.
Thank you for sharing your insight. And to all of you out there, I hope you saw a little bit of the father-daughter dynamic here. I got a little education, some new insight into what it means to be German post-World War II. Thank you all for tuning in. And until the next time.
Bye.